One of the most enduring symbols of Christmas is a manger. But what is so amazing about it isn't so much the fact that a child was laid in a manger. That's clearly unusual in a feeding trough in a barn to lay a child in a manger. But even more incredible is the who that was laid in that manger that makes it so enduring. It's a story that has been told for thousands of years of a baby being born and placed in the manger. But it's his identity that changes everything. It makes it most surprising. We talk a lot about identity in our world. There's identity theft, and then there's scammers trying to steal your identity or pretend there's someone they're not to scam you out of money. And you've had the phone calls, right? And you've had those people that have tried to trick and scam you, and you become cynical. In fact, I read recently about a woman, her name was Amanda, who had lost some ID, and the police had got it, and it was returned to them, and they phoned her to say, we have your ID, come in and pick it up, and she didn't believe them, right? She said thought it was some kind of scam, right? And they texted her a picture of it, still figured it's a scam. So they took a picture of the policeman standing beside his car in uniform, holding her ID, and finally she said, okay, I'll be in to check it out, and came into the police station. But it's so hard in our world because we've been trained, right, to question and to be suspicious of everything. And so when someone says that the identity of that one, that baby in the manger was that he was not just a regular baby, this was the Son of God, like in our world, like that's suspicious. Is that really his identity? Is that really who he is? Isaiah the prophet made this incredible statement 700 years before Jesus was born. In chapter 9, verse 6, he says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders." So he's going to be a ruler. The government will be on his shoulders. I mean, he's going to carry the government. This child who will be born will grow up to be a very powerful, special leader. This son who is given, specially given, appointed for this task. The government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called, and here it is. 4 descriptive terms used. His name will be called, he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now, there are many wonderful counselors in our world, and I suppose that one isn't so surprising, although it's a beautiful name. But what about the others? Mighty God? I mean, who would call a baby, any baby, but particularly a baby of a poor couple who laid their baby in a manger, a mighty God, everlasting Father, a Prince of Peace? Really? I mean, these are pretty powerful descriptions, are they not? Wonderful Counselor, mighty God. I was thinking about that second one especially. That's pretty astounding, right? That this baby would be called the mighty God. And so I looked a little deeper. I said, what is behind that? What word was used, that did Isaiah use when he described this baby as a mighty God? And so I took a look at it. And the word begins with the words E and L. El. It's the often word used in God. It starts off many of the words for God. In fact, here are 7 of them. 7 key ones. Elohim, El-Elyon, El-Shaddai, El-Roi, El-Deah, El-Olam, and El-Gibhor. Have you ever heard some of these before? Perhaps you have. Different names for God that were used in the Old Testament that describe, descriptive names, that describe who God was and what he was like. So I wonder, which one was it in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6? Do you know? Would it be Elohim? Elohim is a very eloquent name for God. It's the first one used in the very first verse of the Bible. In Genesis 1 says, God created the heavens and the earth. Elohim, the creator God, the powerful God that's behind everything that exists. Elohim. It's interesting, this Hebrew word, the Bible is written in Hebrew, this original word, Elohim, is in plural form, actually, of the word, which is interesting given that the Jews were so big on the fact that there was only one God, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and that was hugely important to the Jews. There is but one God. And yet the very first reference to God is in the plural, which is rather curious. Many have said and explained this is that it's a royal plural that shows the fact that God is the God of all. But it's also interesting to note that God is Trinity. Of course, this wasn't thought of way back then in Moses who wrote this with his mind. But can we imagine a God who is one and yet in three persons? It says in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, it says, the Son, this is speaking particularly of Jesus, because this was now after Jesus had lived on earth, a writer by the name of Paul wrote these words, and he said, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. The firstborn would be the head over all creation. So this Son is the image, that's the visible part of an invisible God. You can see what God is like by looking at Jesus. And he's the head over creation. For in him all things were created. Really? So he was involved in creation? So it says, for in him all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. In him, through him, for him. He was there in creation. At the beginning of time, this royal Elohim existed, and it was Jesus who was there. It also talks about in Genesis 1 the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the earth. And there we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In Elohim, the God of creation. Jesus was there. He wasn't just that baby in a manger. He was the creator. Imagine that. A second word in our list, El-Elyon, is an interesting word too. El-Elyon. The reason it's repeated, you see El twice, that's because in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, they don't have superlatives. They don't say like the most or the greatest. They don't have words like that. And so they duplicate words, and by putting it down twice means it's the greatest or the most high God. So El-Elyon is like not just any God, but he's the most high God, the highest of gods. And so that's what El-Elyon would mean by doubling it. It's interesting when this word first shows up in the Bible. El-Elyon. It was a very unusual scene that raises a lot of questions that scholars have wrestled with. What is this all about? But in Abraham's life, before he even changed his name to Abraham, he's called Abram, and he shows up this king Melchizedek. And let me just read you a little bit in Genesis 14. It says, "Then Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He, Melchizedek, was a priest of God Most High, El-Elyon. And he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, by El-Elyon." It's an interesting passage because Abram at this point was God's chosen. Abraham would become the father of the nations. He was like the one who pleased God. You'd think he would be the highest one, and yet there's this mystery person. Hebrews tells us later he had no mother and father, which is really weird. This mystery person who is the Most High. Melchizedek actually translated means king of righteousness. In Hebrews, Jesus is called the king of righteousness. And you start to say, wait a second. is Jesus a Melchizedek? Is it possible that this mystery person who shows up, blesses Abraham, and in fact, a few verses later, Abraham pays him a tithe, 10%. He pays him a tithe to this mystery priest, the King of righteousness. Who is it? David talks about in Psalm 110, he makes a reference back to this. If you check it out, he talks about that the Messiah would be a priest in the line of Melchizedek forever. He's a pretty main character, and he shows up again in the book of Hebrews. They refer to him. As I said, someone without a father and mother, but in the priest whom Jesus replaces. And in fact, it's almost like, I wonder if they're the same person. And there's a theory that many Bible scholars think that this actually was Jesus, who showed up to Abraham and blessed him. And then Abraham went on to become the father of the nation of Israel. Be quite a significant thing. But in this passage, we find the name for the first time, El-Elyon, the Most High God. And then the third one, the third name, the third El word, name for God, is El-Shaddai. El-Shaddai simply means the all-powerful God, the all-powerful one. This is an older word. Doesn't occur later in the Old Testament, only in the books of Genesis and in Job, which was considered to be one of the oldest books in the Bible. Job and Genesis refer to this El-Shaddai, the all-powerful God. It's this picture of a God that nothing is too difficult for him. It was made famous by a song back in the 70s, right? By Amy Grant. She did the song El-Shaddai that talked about this all-powerful God. And so it became a popular word for God again. But it's the idea that God is all-powerful. Imagine that baby so humble in a manger, and yet he was the all-powerful God. It's hard to draw that parallel, but they're one and the same. Another word for God in the Old Testament was the word El-Roi. El-Roi. And this one is the God who sees. It's interesting the person who uses this first. It was a person by the name of Hagar. Hagar was kicked out of her home. She and her son were pushed out by Sarah and Abraham. And they were sent out into the wilderness to fend for themselves. A single mom, that was pretty dangerous. She felt alone, abandoned, vulnerable. And so she prayed to God that night, and she wept. And God came near, and God comforted her. And she responded to God with a prayer. And in that prayer, she calls him the God who sees me. He sees me and knows me. Imagine being plunged into darkness. Maybe the power's gone out. You know, at night there's a storm going on. All of a sudden the lights go out. You've been watching the TV in the basement, right, in the dark. You watch, and everything goes out. And you're sitting there like, where's the candles? Do you remember where you put the candles? You got a flashlight, something. We're trying to figure out where's the phone. You know, and because we're in darkness. And maybe if you got a child, the child would cry out. Well, that's what Hagar did. She cried out to God in the darkness, in her aloneness. And she found God to be a God who sees, God who knows, a God who comforts, who's there for her. In the midst of the dire circumstances, in the midst of the difficulty, God was there. 65 generations later, Malachi, an Old Testament prophet, he wrote some words. They were the very last words. He was the last prophet. If you go to the Old Testament, go to the very last book, it's the book of Malachi. And in the last two verses, this is how the book ends, right? This is how the Old Testament ends, the last words. Malachi 4, 5, and 6. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. And that's the last verse of the Bible. That's the last word in the Old Testament. Destruction. It's the final word. It's like we've come to the end of this, and then God said, okay, lights out, right? And everything went dark. And then 400 years, they didn't hear from God. 400 years, they're under oppression. The next world empire was the Alexander the Great that brought in the Greek Empire and conquered the area. And after him, it was the Ptolemies of Egypt, and then the Seleucids of Syria. And then finally Rome came in. And Rome again conquered their land and made them pay tribute and taxes to their homeland. And so all through this period of time, it felt like it was dark. And where was God? Does he really see? The God who sees, has he turned his back? Has he turned away? Has he shut his eyes? Is he really watching? Is he paying attention? You know, mortals can't see in the dark, but God can. And in Psalm 139, verse 12, it says, even the darkness will not be dark to you, David writes, right? Even the darkness won't be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. It doesn't matter if it's dark. God sees, even when we can't. God sees us. And he knows the way forward. He knows what we've been through. And when you've been kicked out like Hagar, or even can't find a room like Mary and Joseph, and are told to go out to sleep in the barn, and have a baby born in the midst of the darkness and the aloneness in a foreign town. God sees, and God knows, and God's there. Because he is El-Roi, the King, the God who sees. The fourth name around this idea of El-Elyon is the word El-Deah. El-Deah, the God who knows. This is an interesting one too. It's first used by a woman named Hannah. Hannah had been unable to have a child for years. And she was praying. She was heartbroken. If you know anybody that have not been able to have a child, and the heartache and the difficulty and the strain that brings in a person's life. Well, Hannah was there, and she couldn't have a child. She couldn't bear a child, and it was painful. And she goes to the temple one day, and she's praying and pouring her heart out to God and weeping. And the priest comes by and says, God is going to answer your prayers. And she'd been praying for a child. And sure enough, she goes home and she has a baby, and she brings the baby back to the temple. And she says this prayer of thanksgiving that was recorded in your Bibles. And this is what it says in 1 Samuel. This is what she said in her prayer. It says, for the Lord is a God who knows. El-Deah. He's a God who knows. He knows my situation. He knows how hard this has been. He knows about my pain. It's interesting, the Christmas story also has the story of a woman who's barren named Elizabeth. And she ends up becoming pregnant, giving birth in her old age to the forerunner of Jesus, Jesus' cousin. She gives birth to John the Baptist, who announces Jesus to the world. But Elizabeth also went through a lot of years of pain, unable to have children, till finally God blessed her. And she realized, yeah, God knows. He's the God who knows. He knows what it's like to go through difficult times. Jesus himself must have had some challenges. Although we don't know much about his earlier life, we do know some of the words that were tossed his way later, and probably even the earlier life. He knows his hurts. Being called an illegitimate bastard child, to be rejected, to be insulted, to be put to death by your peers? You see, Jesus knows because he's been there. He knows what it is to experience heartache and difficulty. He's the God who knows. He's El-Deah. The next word, the sixth word, is El-Olam, the name for God. El-Olam. These are all Hebrew names. El-Olam, the everlasting God. The everlasting God. In fact, in Isaiah 9:6, we have one of the words for everlasting. The everlasting Father, he says, is one name he gives Jesus. So it's not the one. So in Isaiah 9:6, we have not yet found the word that he used. You probably guessed it's probably the last one. Yeah. Well, before we get there, here's the sixth one, right? El-Olam, the everlasting God. He's timeless. Jesus was there in creation. Jesus was there perhaps even in Melchizedek. Jesus was there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Jesus was there when John was on an isolated island, a rocky island, a prison out in the Mediterranean. He was put out on this island of Patmos and left alone. And Jesus shows up in a vision to him. And these are the words, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the Alpha and Omega, says the Lord God, who is, who was, and who is to come, the Almighty. The Alpha and Omega are the first and last letters in the Greek language. In other words, what he's saying, I'm the first and the last, the beginning and the end, the originator and the terminator. I am Alpha and Omega. That means beyond time and space. He was there in the beginning. He's there at the end. This multidimensional being became a 3D person, the image of the invisible God, so we could see him. He became one of us. Not a part of time and space, but joins us in time and space. He is El-Olam, the beginning and the end. It's hard for us even to imagine. We're so time-bound. Everything is related to time. To think outside of time is almost impossible. And yet that's where God exists. Jesus is there. He sees the end and the beginning because he's the Alpha and Omega. And then in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, he says this, but when the set time had fully come, it's like God had a plan. He broke into time and space, and it was the exact time, the set time, when it had fully come. He was ready. It says God sent his Son, born of a woman. When Jesus came into the world, it was all part of his plan. God had set it all up. And he came and lived among us. El-Olam, the everlasting God. That baby in the manger was so much more than you could imagine. So much more than a baby. He was Elohim, El-Elyon, El-Shaddai, El-Roi, El-Deah, El-Olam, and finally, El-Gibhor. The last one, El-Gibhor, the God who saves. And sure enough, this is the word we find in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6. It's translated by the translators as mighty God. And the thinking, this word Gibhor basically is the picture of a hero, a deliverer, someone who saves, who breaks in the midst of difficult times and saves you out of it. He's the hero. He's the mighty one, the mighty warrior, the God who saves. That's the picture Isaiah wants you to think about. Somehow when we think about mighty God, we don't always see the save aspect. But that's why he came. And that's why it's so significant when an angel shows up to Joseph in Matthew chapter 1 and speaks to Joseph, who was considering leaving Mary because was she unfaithful? How did she have a child? We hadn't slept together. So he's got all this going on, and the angel shows up and says this in Matthew 1. Joseph, he says, next slide, yeah. Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus because, why? Why do you give him the name Jesus? Because he will save his people from their sins. He is the mighty God, the El-Gibhor, the one who saves. And Jesus, the name Jesus means Savior. He is mighty to save. Right? He is the one who will save. And not saving from the governments or from your difficult situations. He saves people from something that runs through the heart of every single human being. He will save his people from their sins. A Savior for everyone. A Savior needed by everyone because we have sin in our lives. And the gospel story of Jesus tells us that if we simply believe in Jesus, that he will forgive us our sins and cleanse us from them all of our sin. And we just have to believe in him. Well, think about that. In light of this morning, what does it mean to believe in him? It means to believe that he's not just a baby lying in a manger. That he is so much more than you can imagine. Right? He's the God who sees. He's the God who knows. He's the God who saves. Right? He will save his people from their sins. Imagine that you are going through some of your grandpa's stuff. Your grandpa's recently passed away, and you're digging through some of his things he's left behind, and you find a coin. And you wonder to yourself, how much is that worth? And you decide to take it down to an antique dealer or a coin collector and say, I'm just wondering how much this coin is worth. And when he looks at it, his eyes get big, and he says, whoa, that's worth thousands. And you're like, I had no idea. I was hoping I might get a few dollars, but thousands? And that feeling is how we feel about this baby. It's like, okay, I expected this, but wow, so much more. As we unpack the characteristics, the names of Jesus, we realize there's so much more there than could be imagined. He is Jesus, the Savior of the world. I remember back in Bible college, there's a strange, I happened to think of this story in this context, but I was a friend who showed up in my second year there and had a room next to me, and I got to know him. He was from North Dakota, and he was so fired up about Jesus. He had become a Christian only 3 or 4 years ago, and everything changed in him, he says, since he found Jesus. And his enthusiasm for Jesus, you wanted to be around him because he was just so excited and wanting to learn and wanting to grow. And you often see that in some younger Christians, right, who are just so hungry to learn more and to see more. Because he realized that there's more there. And he imagined, a God out there, but when he started to realize who Jesus was, he wanted to go deeper and learn more and more, and you want to be around someone like that because you realize that Jesus is more than you can even imagine. And for people who have been around church a long time, we kind of forget that because we hear it, but sometimes we step back and start thinking, wow, yeah, he's amazing. He's big. And despite the greatness and grandeur of it, he came down for you and me. And he went to a cross. In the next few moments, we're going to celebrate communion. I thought it was interesting.